some of the blunders that some of the movie stars have made over time, at least that's cost as much. For example, John Travolta was the one that was chosen to play Forrest Gump. And he didn't want it, so Tom Hanks took it. And who can imagine Forrest Gump being played by anyone but Tom Hanks? Matt Damon was supposed to star in Avatar. And he was filming Bourne Ultimatum at the same time. And so as a result, now he made money from Bourne Ultimatum, but he lost out on $120 million. He also missed out on playing Harvey Dent in the Dark Knight. Jim Carrey was supposed to star in the film Elf. He was the chosen one, and when it finally went into production, quite a bit later, he didn't have any interest in it. And so Will Ferrell got the part. Audrey Hepburn starred in the movie Breakfast at Tiffany's. It was designed for Marilyn Monroe, and her acting coach talked her out of it. Harrison Ford was Steven Spielberg's #1 choice to play Dr. Alan Grant in Jurassic Park. Ford turned it down. And who can imagine anyone but Meg Ryan playing the part of Annie Reed in Sleepless in Seattle? Julia Roberts turned down that part. And who can imagine anybody but Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan in it? And there's more. Hugh Jackman turned down James Bond role in Casino Royale. Liam Neeson was to play Abraham Lincoln in the movie Lincoln. Robert Redford turned down the Clark Kent Superman in that day and era. Brad Pitt and Sandra Bullock both turned down The Matrix. And can you imagine Tom Selleck playing Indiana Jones? I mean, no, it's just that he was the choice, and Harrison Ford ended up with it. And so you can imagine these actors, sometimes they didn't have a choice because they were in another film, but the millions and millions of dollars that some of them lost because they just weren't interested and had no idea. Hindsight is 20/20. And sometimes that 20/20 hindsight's pretty costly. So we continue with the Old Testament epic journey through the Bible, and we're completing last week's message in Numbers, one of the big epic journeys, that is, of the children of Israel being led to the southern border of the land of Canaan, their promised land. They were led by God from Egypt to Mount Sinai, where they were for a little bit over 2 years. And then God led them from there in a pillar of cloud, pillar of fire, to the southern border of the land of Canaan. And they turned God down. 10 of the spies convinced the rest of them. God instructed Moses, tell the spies, 1 spy from each of the 12 tribes, go into the land of Canaan, this promised land, and search it out. And answer these questions, specific questions. Is the land good or bad? What are the cities like? Are they walled or unwalled? Fortified or not fortified? Is the soil good or bad? Are the trees on it? Or is it barren? If possible, bring back some of the fruit. And so 2 of the spies brought back a single cluster of grapes that they had to carry it between a pole. It was that big. Just as God had described to Abraham and all the ancestors since all the generations, it was indeed a land flowing with milk and honey. But when the 12 spies came back from searching the land, 10 of them said, impossible. There is no way. It's occupied by giants. And they look at us like grasshoppers, and we saw them as giants, and we viewed ourselves as grasshoppers. And the people of that land are strong. They live in fortified cities. They're powerful. There's no way that we can conquer them. And as we saw in last week's message, there was only 1 spy at that time that we knew of that said, we can do this. If God is with us, we can do this, and He is for us. So just to review last week, we had 2 points. Number 1, never forget what God has done for you. Never forget what He's done for us. God had worked in so many miraculous ways. I mean, the 10 plagues, the death angel, the Red Sea leading them through on dry ground, then crushing the Egyptian army. led them to Mount Sinai with this pillar of cloud, pillar of fire. And while they were there, they saw the presence of God at Mount Sinai. They were terrified. And then God picked up that pillar of cloud and fire and led them on to their promised land, to the southern border. And yet the 10 spies said, no way. It's impossible. How many of us are just as guilty as those 10 spies? And then we also pointed out that learning from God's past involvement in our lives, we can trust Him today. I mean, we've seen God act in our lives. If you haven't, you're not looking. You're blind. Each of us, I believe, can look back and we can see things that God has done specifically. I mean, we missed that intersection of the person that ran that stop sign or stop light by just a couple seconds. Otherwise, we'd have been in the middle of the intersection. Various things like this that we just thank you, God, and then we go on, and sometimes we forget about Him. We've got to stay faithful to God because He is faithful to us, and we've got to remember these things. So, learning from God's past involvement in our lives, we can trust Him today. So, we continue with the second part of our message, when faith falters. We're going to read from the book of Numbers, chapter 14. We read chapter 13 last week, so this is the second part of it, devastating part. Numbers 14, beginning with verse 1. That night, this is after the spies had brought back the report of 10 spies said we can't do it. That night, all the members of the community raised their voices and wept out loud. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, if only we had died in Egypt or in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? And they said to each other, we should choose a leader and go back to Egypt. Then Moses and Aaron fell face down in front of the whole Israelite assembly gathered there. Joshua son of Nun and Caleb son of Jephthah, who were among those who had explored the land, tore their clothes, which was the ancient way of agonizing or grieving over something. And they said to the entire Israelite assembly, the land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, He will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them. But the whole assembly talked about stoning them. Then the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of the meeting to all the Israelites. The Lord said to Moses, how long will these people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in me, in spite of all the signs I have performed among them? Now, remember, God's reminding them, my presence has been with them. And they're forgetting about it. I will strike them down with the plague and destroy them. But I will make you into a nation greater and stronger than they. It's easy to see how quickly they forgot about what God had done for them. Actually, they turned their backs on God. It wasn't just forgetting. They turned their backs on God. The 10 spies lacked faith. They lacked trust. They lacked the memory. And 2 of the spies that we now know as Joshua and Caleb were the only 2 that said, we can do this. Sadly, all groups, all organizations and congregations have a cynic, a pessimist, whichever word you want to write in there. And usually there's more than one in that congregation or organization or group, whatever it is. That person has this aggressively negative attitude who says, we can never do it. There's not enough of us. It's too expensive. We don't need that. The cynic that says we're too weak. And you know why we're too weak? Because of the cynic, because of the pessimist. They're stuck in the mud. They're content. They like it as it is. They lack faith, or we can just say they're downright lazy. Sometimes the person says, I cannot afford to help. Because I can't do it, I'm going to vote against it. I'm going to shut it down. You see, they're looking at the project through their own eyes and not through the eyes of God. It's been several years ago that the church was going to do something, and it was going up for a vote, and this person said, well, I'm not for it. I said, well, why? They said, because I can't afford it. I said, it's not about you. It's about the church. It's about the congregation. It's about what does God want us to do? Yet they were looking at it through their own eyes. And we tend to do that. And sometimes it's tough to get out of ourselves and to look at it to see what does God want. We have to view everything through God's eyes, and that's hard. I'm not throwing stones at you. I'm throwing them at myself as well. How does God view this project? How does God view this venture? See, pessimists and cynics don't look at it the way that God looks at it. They look at it without the vision of God. They fail to see what can happen if God gets involved. This is what those 10 spies were doing. They were looking at it through their own eyes. We can't do this. They failed to look at God. The reason some small congregations stay small and some small businesses stay small is because they want to stay that way. And they don't view things through God's eyes. Of the 12 spies, ask yourself, who am I? Are you one of the 12? Or one of the 10, I should say? Or are you one of the 2? What does God want you to do? Get outside yourself. What does God want us to do as a congregation? In what way can we glorify God in this project or whatever it might be? Ask yourself, am I willing to trust God? Do I have the faith in God? I mean, it's easy to say, but you can just think of your own personal life when you're afraid to tell somebody about Jesus or afraid to do something and you say, I can't do it. That's just not me. That's not looking at it through God's eyes. It's looking at it through your own eyes. So ask yourself, am I the cynic? Am I the pessimist? Evaluate yourself. I need to evaluate myself. Am I comfortable? Am I content? Or am I lazy? And let me just say this, the older that we get, we tend to get content. When we're younger, we're adventurous. We step out, we do things. And then the older we get more settled in life. Life is behind us. And it's like, I think it's going to stay where I'm at. God never gives us that choice. He doesn't give me that choice, and He doesn't give you that choice. Or are you saying, well, we tried that in the past and it didn't work? And it might not have. Maybe it was the wrong time. Maybe we didn't have the right people in place, or God didn't have the right people in place. Maybe this person is saying, hey, I can make it work. Now, I'm as guilty as the next person. It wasn't that long ago somebody came up to me here and said, hey, why don't we do this and this? It was on a Sunday morning. And you know what I told him? We tried that. It didn't work. And I realized, boy, that was a dumb thing to say. I'm as guilty as the rest of you. And we've all got that pessimist part of us at times. We've all got that cynic in us at times. We've all got that. It just won't work. It's just too big. You see, pessimism and cynicism are contagious. Pessimism is contagious. And we see that in this Israelite example that the 10 spies, the majority, came back and said, we can't do it. 2 spies said, oh no, we are the majority because we have God on our side. We can do this. all the excitement that the Israelites had going up to this location, Kadesh Barnea, God was with them. They saw God with them, and yet when it came down to it, the entire assembly said, "Oh, we can't do it. We believe the 10 spies." So all of us have that in us at times. So if somebody says, "Hey, snap out of it," let's pause and evaluate ourselves and say, am I the pessimist? Am I the cynic? So don't be too quick to disregard them. Now, we do need to look at another side of this, because we have to have balance. There is such a thing as blind stupidity. And Jesus talks about this. In the book of Luke, Jesus talks about the cost of following him. And he gives an example that really applies to this situation here with the Israelites. In Luke chapter 14, verses 28 through 31, Jesus said, "Hey, this is the cost of following me. You got to count the cost." And he gives the example. If you're going to build a tower, do you have the money? Do you have the power? Do you have the personnel? Do you have the ability to complete that tower rather than getting it half built and then everybody laughing at you? If you're a king going to war, do you have the military power? Do you have the soldiers? And today we can say, do you have the Army, the Air Force, the Marines, the Navy? Do you have everybody that you need? Can you do this? And if you can't, Jesus says, hey, you better think about this. So we're not looking at this as foolishness. We have to count the cost, even when doing something for God, for Jesus. But the cost also includes who's on our side when he wants us to do it. This assembly of Israel, they were ready to take the land until these spies came back. And just think about it. They showed them the produce of the land, but then they start talking about, there's giants in the land. There's fortified cities. Of course, that we get the 2020 vision looking back at Jericho and how easily God brought it down and gave them the victory. And they refused to go into their promised land. God told Moses that God, was going to destroy the entire Israelite community, the whole assembly. I'm going to start over with you, Moses. I'm going to build a stronger nation, and we're going to start with you. I'm just going to wipe them out with a plague. And Moses pleaded to God, saying, you can't do that. We're going to look bad in the eyes of the world, of the Egyptians and everybody. And Moses intervened, and God relented. But, we stressed that but last week. And so here we are again. The generation of Israelites that refused to go in didn't get to go in. They turned their backs on God, and God said, fine, here's the punishment. You're not going in. You're going to die. You're all going to die, 20 years old and older, and those that refuse to go in. Now, see, this is something I hadn't caught before, is that it wasn't just everyone 20 years old and older that died. That isn't quite the case, as the book of Numbers says. God said those that were 20 years old and older who refused to go in. So evidently there were some other ones in the assembly that were willing to go. So the way that is worded in Numbers, 14:29, that there were those that said, we can do this, and God rewarded them with life also. God sentenced that generation to 40 years of roaming the wilderness, those who had complained against God. And that entire generation died off because they refused. What happened? Well, the people repented when they heard what God's judgment was on them. They said, okay, we're going to go in and do it. Moses said, don't do it. I tell you, don't do this. They went in anyway, and they were defeated, soundly defeated. And they had to run back to the assembly with their tails tucked between their legs. And for 40 years they roamed the wilderness until all of those pessimistic, cynic people died off. And God built a new nation, of a younger generation, The story doesn't end there. I mean, that's a lot of the pessimistic view of everything, the downside. We can't forget the two spies that said, we can do this, Joshua and Caleb. Haven't talked much about them. We talked about the 10 spies because that's the emphasis here. That's the main thing, is that these people were so unwilling to go that they all died. Joshua and Caleb trusted God, and their faith and their courage rewarded them. So to learn about these two guys, we got to skip 40 years. We got to go to after this failed attempt in the land of Canaan, their promised land. Now at this point, Moses is dead. Joshua is their new leader. Joshua is the one that was Moses' at his side this whole time. So we have Joshua and Caleb both, but Joshua was the leader, and God prepared Joshua to lead after Moses was dead. So Joshua, we got the book of Joshua, and God knew how tough it was going to be to lead these Israelites, this new generation. He knew how tough it was going to be to go in. So we go to Joshua chapter 1. And so we picked a few verses here. Joshua chapter 1, verse 6. First part, God says, be strong and courageous. And in verse 7, the first part, he says, be strong and very courageous, telling this to Joshua. And then again in verse 9, God says, have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Nobody said it was going to be easy. God said, I'm at your side. I'll be with you. And so we can learn that conquering giants for God takes faith and it takes courage. Conquering giants for God takes faith and it takes courage. 40 years later, after that debacle of the previous generation, God told Joshua, be strong, be courageous, it's going to be tough. And he repeated this 3 times, be strong and courageous, be strong and very courageous. Now I have commanded you, be strong and courageous. As God was leading them and preparing them to go into their promised land, they were going to face the same people that their parents and grandparents had refused to go in and conquer. And they did it. Just as strong a people, maybe even stronger. Just as huge. The people were giants. The Israelites were like grasshoppers, like ants. The cities were still walled, still fortified, still protected. And God led them in to conquer. Now the question is, what about us? What giants do we face in our personal lives? Could be sickness, could be illness, could be God's calling us to do something. Could just be financial problems, it could be job. What giants are we facing? And we have to remember how God got us through us in the past, and He'll get us through it in the future. We don't always like the situation. We don't always like the outcome. It's like parents and kids. Parents know what's best. As kids, we didn't know what was best. We were afraid, and the parents made us do things we didn't want to do, and we complained. But as we grew up, we saw that our parents were wise. And that's God with us. So look at yourself. What giants are you facing? Do you trust God? Are you confident? Are you strong and courageous? Do you have faith? How about here, in this congregation? What giants are we facing? What do we need to do? And I don't have anything in mind. I'm just saying, is God speaking to us in some way to individuals and say, hey, we can do this, or we need to do that? Are we strong? Are we courageous? Not by ourselves, but in God? With God's power, with God's might? And here's the question. What are we losing out on? What if God is saying to us, hey, you can do this, and we say, no, we can't do it? What if the majority, the cynics, the pessimists say, we can't do this? And the question we need to ask ourselves on, if we say, no, we can't do this, what are we losing out on? I mean, it's an example of the Israelites. What is it in your life that God is saying, I need you to do this for me, and we're turning him down, and God said, okay, you lost it. No more. I'll pass it on to somebody else. Somebody else will get the blessing. What are we facing? Individually or as a group, as a congregation, as the church, that we're turning our backs on God. Now we begin talking about the actors and actresses. They were the ones that a lot of them were chosen for the role and they turned it down. They didn't think it was the right one. And the painful experience where they lost millions of dollars. And you know, to an actor and to a lot of us, we like the prestige. We like the recognition. You can think of actors and actresses that you think a lot of, and they've been in a series of films, and it just wouldn't be the same without them. You know, they enjoy that stardom too. They enjoy that recognition, and they lost out on it. They made their mistakes. But the question for you and me is, what mistakes are we making that we're turning our backs on God? Which is far more important than millions of dollars. What are we missing out on? God did not give that generation a second chance. He gives us lots of second chances, but sometimes he says, that's it. I'm done with you. Doesn't mean you're lost. Doesn't mean you're gone to hell over it. We're just saying there was an opportunity. What might you and I be missing? That's the question for us this morning. I don't mean to pound into us that we're all a bunch of losers. No, I want to encourage us that we can do it with God at our side. And we can do this with each other at our side. That's the power of the church. The strength of the church is not only God, but it's each other. Wrapping our arms together, locking our arms together, wrapping our arms around each other, loving each other, and saying, we can do this. You can do this. You can't stay home and get this. It's the power of coming here together on Sunday mornings. It's the power of small groups. Guys, where are you at in small groups? The power of connection. The power of God. What we miss out on, we may never know. Let's not disappoint God. Let's pray. Father, what are we missing out on? I mean, as individuals, what am I missing out on? God, how many years did it take me to go into ministry? I sat on the tractor seat crying my eyes out at times, and I loved what I was doing, and I think you were still building me. And then I finally gave in. I finally said, okay, let's take that bold step. And I'm a poor example, Father. There's others that are better. Jesus, what if you'd have said, Father, I don't think so. I think I just want to stay where I'm at here in heaven. No. Man, if there's an example, it's your Son, Jesus Christ, that said, yes, Father, it's a good plan. I'll do it. I'll go. I'll be that perfect sacrifice. I'll live the life that they can't. I'll go to the cross. I'll die. That's love. For God so loved the world, you, God, that you gave your Son, and He gave Himself. Help us to be as willing as Him. In His name we pray. Amen.